Welcome to Between the Reads, where we shine a spotlight on some of the most talented Black authors in the industry to discuss their works of fiction and the inspirations behind them. Each episode will dive into the rich and diverse world of literature, exploring everything from historical fiction to romance and speculative fiction to YA and beyond. Tune in as we celebrate the voices of Black authors and the power of storytelling. Are you ready, Booze and Bros? Then sit back, relax, and let's get to it. A.E. Rooks hopes to always be a student of history, which hasn't stopped her from studying everything else. While her debut, The Black Joke, the true story of one ship's battle against the slave trade, explores a little-discussed facet of the transatlantic slave trade and is currently in contention for the Maritime Foundation's Mountbatten Award for Best Book, previous writing credits also include the column Between the Briefs, for which she won 2 national awards for sex-positive journalism, a 2-time Jeopardy champion whose schooling spans theater, law, library and information science, education and human sexuality. Rooks's literary passions are united by what the past can teach us about the present, how history shapes our future, and above all, really interesting stories. Rooks, welcome to Between the Reads.
We did
How
it.
Are you?
We did it. I'm
Finally.
great. Finally. Yeah. No, I'm
Been
delightful.
to me right in front of my face, and
I'm loving that we're just starting with the dance break. Why not?
starting
Begin as
right
we need
off.
to go on.
First episode of season 4, and we are already just clowning. I love it. I love it. We gotta laugh because I mean this book was so serious. You know, we gotta laugh through. We gotta laugh through it. Yeah.
It's real.
So tell us what this book, The Black Joke, is all about.
So the simplest, there's not a really simple version, I'll preface this by saying, but the simplest version is that it is about a ship that was a slaver in the early 19th century, built in Baltimore, we think, or rather I should say we assume, and
Damn it, Baltimore, because I'm right near here.
we were just so good at building ships, just all kinds of ships.
All kinds of ships.
All kinds of ships. So fast. Such fast ships. So this ship is built, right? It is ostensibly built for an emperor. If it is the ship that people believe it to be, matching up documentation, it was built for the Emperor of Brazil at the time, which is also Portugal. Excuse me. And so it is on the water. It's super fast. It has this reputation. It's called the Henrietta. It's super fast, and like nobody can catch this ship. It makes at least 6 successful slaving voyages. It is detained once, but successful by their metric, obviously not by the modern one. But so they're detained once. Nothing comes of it. Then, luckily, one night they get captured by the British, and then we have to deal with the fact that the British are not. They're both the bad guy and the decided to do something about their badness a little bit guy. I hesitate to say good.
I was going to say, don't say good. Please don't say good.
But, they were involved in a way that we could call helpful. So what ends up happening is they capture this ship and they repurpose it as to catch other slavers because it is so quick. And they use it for a few years and then some things go down. Is to keep it from spoilering. Although, I mean, can you really spoiler the slave trade?
I mean, you could with this book because this really kind of goes through, the part of the transatlantic slave trade that we think about, but we don't think about. Like, we know the ships, but we don't know the whole story of the ships and them cruising up and down the coast and all of that. I was fascinated by it because I could actually see, even though this is a nonfiction book, I could see in my head the ships and I could visualize what was going on. I mean, we all have that image of the slave ship, the drawing, and we know how
the one we all see.
Yeah, the one we all see, but we don't understand that there are multiple ships. I mean, this kind of we know there are multiple ships, but this really lays it out.
Yeah, and
for it.
it's just there's so many, and there are like some like I want to say it's like some graphics that you can do, like you can check out online, where they like show the like trajectory and like sort of the increase in volume of like traffic in the slave trade over the course of time. So it's like a time lapse thing, and then it starts to get really intense, right? Because there's like
Right.
a ton of ships everywhere. I'm sorry, that was a big gesture for people just chilling on YouTube. Apologies. Um, well, I refuse to be constrained by this box. So,
We were
um,
cutting up like this before the show, y'all. I mean, we
it's
just
true. It's so true. This you're joining this part of the program already.
yeah.
Um,
So tell us a little bit about. I know you don't want to spoil it, but tell us about the black joke itself. This is one spoiler I will give. The Henrietta becomes the black joke, which ends up, patrolling for slaver ships to stop them.
yes. And that's a solid spoiler because I think it happens in the first chapter. So it's
Right.
okay. If it's available on Google Books, is it a spoiler? So these are the questions we ask ourselves. No, so the Black Joke itself, right? So it's a Baltimore Clipper, which is a particularly unique American form of shipping, unsurprisingly. But that expands to mean a style of ship, not simply a ship made in Baltimore, right? Or a clipper made in Baltimore, quite frankly, which is very small for what the British were using to patrol. Like, we have to bear in mind that they had just gotten out of war with Napoleon pretty recently, or we're still technically in it in some cases, depending on when you want to measure this moment. By the time the Black Joke is sailing, they'd been out of it for a few years. I guess we're talking the Treaty of Vienna, like, 12 years. Yeah. So,
Just figured that out in her head, y'all.
hopefully I'm right, because somebody on the internet's going to be like, I read your book, and I'm going to tell you it's 13 or something like that. Like, watch it happen. The internet is cruel. But, right, so you have this ship. And so what they're using for a lot of this patrolling are these giant, much bigger frigates. Now, they're not the huge ships of the line, like, if anybody's really into maritime history and they've seen, like, the big, huge, like, Trafalgar, like, these massive ships. Not those, right? We're talking still smaller, but still ships that would easily carry over 200 men, potentially, right? Or 300 even. So big ships. By contrast, the Black Joke carries about 50 and change, usually. Maybe closer to 70 if you really count everybody, but it depends on how you do your math, right? And when you're talking to them. So it's a much smaller ship. It's a brig. So it's a small brig. We don't know what it looks like, which is wild, because it was probably the most famous ship during its existence in the world, potentially. Like, it really quite possibly could have been, because its exploits were very sort of widely reported, because it had been a fast ship before. So at least among sailors, we can say that, right? Like, oh, it was a known quantity, but we don't have any record of what it looked like. So the closest we can get is a ship that was very similar, that the Black Joke actually helped capture, which originally was called, I believe the Dos Amigos, and then it becomes the Fair Rosamond. And so that ship, you can build models of that ship and like see how they were actually built. But what made them so sort of crucial was how fast they were compared to other ships, because American shipping had been built with the idea that we could never compete with Britain in the War of 1812, which would also have been somewhat recently concluded. We couldn't compete with them on size. We couldn't compete with them on standardization of like munitions and guns and ammo and all that jazz. And we couldn't compete with them for manpower, right? It wasn't going to happen. So, they came up with something else, which is to do smaller, faster ships that could sort of like hit and run, get away really quickly, and evade these larger British foes with much more gunpowder, like firepower that way. And so the Black Joke basically uses this model, but turns it on slaving vessels, which for the most part were bigger than it. It carried one gun for most of its career, too, at one point.
Mm-hmm.
And like I said, didn't have many folks on it. And it was unequivocally the most successful ship in the squadron. It's not close when it comes to captures. It's not remotely close. So for its entire time serving the Royal Navy, it was their most effective deterrent against the slave trade, such that slavers would, by the end of it, towards the end of its career, would deliberately avoid wherever Black Joke was said to be chilling. Like they would
Wow.
potentially stay in port for months
All
to avoid that.
right. Yeah.
Yeah, so it had
That's
a real
wild.
deterrent effect
Hmm.
until it didn't.
Yeah, and that to me, and then it just made me think about, okay, so all these enslaved people are being held for months
Hmm.
until
Yeah,
the black joke was gone, and I mean that was
yeah,
even part of the normal process anyway, was that they walked for miles and days, and then were like the door
with
of
the
no
coffles. Yeah,
return. They were put in these dark holes and were there
hmm,
for months at
yeah,
a time.
barracoons.
Yeah, the barracoons, and that just made me think of that, and I was just like, wow, the things that we are here by sheer will and resilience.
Truth. There is just facts on facts. One of the best books I read about like sort of what happened on those ships was Swan Domesticatines, and it is Slavery at Sea, I believe it's called,
Okay.
and it was just really like not only just the even getting to there, right, but just the
Mm-hmm.
process of being on one of those ships was,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was part of the reason that the Royal Navy was convinced to side with abolitionists in
Mm-hmm.
Britain when it came to ending the slave trade, which was a completely separate affair from ending slavery, for
Mm-hmm.
those who don't know. But the reason that the Royal Navy, in part, was convinced to side with them is because they realized that they were losing upwards of a fifth of
Right.
able-bodied sailors to attrition because they got sick or died working on
Mm-hmm.
slaving vessels. Like
Mm-hmm.
slaving vessels were literally killing potential soldiers that they would like to send to war.
Mm-hmm.
So
So they
that's a
didn't
problem.
care. They didn't give a damn that they were enslaving people. It's no, we can't afford to lose our army.
Right. Like, I mean, and there were obviously forces who very much did, right? There were
Right.
individuals and organizations who did. But I'd say that the Royal Navy's particular interest in it
Yeah.
was more driven by context and reality than
Mm-hmm.
by altruism or ethos, ethics,
Right.
whatever,
Right.
however you want
Right.
to
Exactly.
conceptualize that.
Exactly. Exactly. Now you have a lot of resources in this book, a lot of citations. Tell us about the research process that you went through for this book and how long it took you to actually write it.
Ooh, okay. The research process was interesting because I actually started. I mean, it obviously had been proposed and whatnot before that, but so the first time I really got to do a big research trip was in September of 2019. And
Mm.
so I was supposed to go back that spring to London to go to some different archives, and then to also, I spent most of my time at the National Maritime Museum and the
Mm-hmm.
Carrot Archives. Those people are great. Love them. But and I was supposed to go to Sierra Leone as well. I was going to try to go to Freetown
Mm-hmm.
because actually see
Right.
it and sort of
Mm-hmm.
experience that.
Mm-hmm.
And
Then the
obviously,
pandemic.
COVID decided it wouldn't let any of us be great.
Mm-hmm.
And so okay, now we're going to have to do this differently. One thing
Right.
that was really, really helpful is the amount of sources that have been digitized or made publicly available online.
Mm-hmm.
Like I was able to access the like official records in the British parliamentary papers from all correspondence from the court at Freetown,
Mm-hmm.
the Court of Mixed Commission, which is where they adjudicated whether or not these folks were slavers
Mm-hmm.
because they still had to be tried.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was able to access like records of that correspondence, which included the captures, right, of basically every ship that
Mm-hmm.
is captured in this book, because there would have been a record of that and a resulting trial, you
Mm-hmm.
know? So that was helpful. I should say I'm still really, do not anticipate that my next work will be a maritime work, but I still very much actually want to go to Sierra Leone. Just to one, to go, but also two, to sort of, I had always planned to stay for a bit longer. And because I do have a background in like library and information science, I thought it would be cool to see if I could, organize a way to help while I was there because Sierra Leone's archives are endangered. And so you
Okay.
have material sort of like crumbling as we speak, and so there's a rush and a pressure to try to like document and digitize sort of as much as possible, and like it's an ongoing effort. But yeah, so I was like, that's exciting, but no.
Didn't
So
happen.
no, no, no. But another thing that was helpful is because it was a pandemic, I mean, thanks, I guess. And so many places weren't accessible. A lot of things online that are normally behind paywalls or behind credential walls or whatever were actually available, which was life-saving. It's like I
Right.
cannot emphasize enough how much that helped.
Right.
And so basically just really using I have a master's degree in research functionally. So like really using that degree to supplement what I knew I could not get, which is my hands on anyone's actual papers. Right? I cite many sources who cite folks'
Right.
actual letters, right? But I'm like um did my best,
Yeah.
but this is as good as it's getting. But there's
Right.
still like 70 pages of citations and sources. So I mean, obviously, I went buck wild, but it was interesting because it's one of those things where obviously I found it and I found it in a lot of places, but it is very much not a talked about thing anymore. Like it's sort of like when we talk about the transience of fame now, like this is a good example of that, right? Because
Right.
you'd think that something like this would have been aggressively remembered, even just in a sort of self-congratulatory, oh yeah, kind of way,
Right.
or
Right. Right.
something like that. But no, not really. Yeah.
And so, how many years did it take you to write this book?
Well, so I said 2019. So if we go for the proposal, probably would have been in that March. So we'll just include 2019 in there.
Okay. Okay.
So 2019, 2022.
So 2 years about. Okay.
Yeah, I guess it came out last year. So that's the beginning of 2021.
Yeah.
Yeah, two and a half.
Yeah. Wow.
That was maybe
Wow.
a little.
Y'all, she's so funny. For people that are listening and not watching, go watch this on YouTube because her facial expressions are just 100%. I love it.
What can I say? She's expressive.
Me too. Me too.
Right?
So, how do you think the efforts of abolitionists in Britain compare to the efforts of abolitionists in other countries, like here in the States? Well, what would become the United States?
Well, that's interesting. I think part of it kind of depends on if we're talking about slavery or the slave trade. You know?
Right. Okay.
Because here, the slave trade ended basically by congressional act. Wham, bam, thank you, ma'am. We're done. That would be the international slave trade. let's
Right.
let's be
Right.
clear,
Right. Right.
right? But that was it. Like it was, of all people, Thomas Jefferson said the international slave trade was like a violation of human right. You're like, and so it was a relatively easy enough done thing. At that point, only one state even still had international slave trading legal, and I believe it was South Carolina. So it
No
wasn't
surprise there.
like but it wasn't like one of those things, or it's sort of a sleeves out of your vest thing almost. Like the United States was not the most prolific. It did not have that market cornered. We did not hold any sort of majority share in like how many people were transported. We were like tiny, tiny fish in the slavery pond, which feels very weird to say as people who
Right.
came up here. But the U.S.'s slavery system was so self-contained, right? Like they had completely circumvented the middleman and found the way to like self-replenish. So they did not care.
Right.
cotton wasn't as murderous as sugar. So you could
Mm-hmm.
work somebody for a hell of a lot longer,
Right.
not to mention anything
Mm-hmm.
else you might be growing. So
Mm-hmm.
in the United States, it was like, we don't need to import.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah,
We're
that was so
cool.
interesting to me in the book. It's like, yeah, okay, the slave trade was abolished in what, 1807? Um,
1807 and then enforced in 1808. Yeah.
right. But here they were just like, okay, well, we're not going to import them anymore, but we're going to breed them and still grow them.
Right.
And it's interesting that you make that distinction between slavery and the slave trade, because
Yeah.
although one stopped in the 1800s,
Mhm.
slavery still went on for another 60 some odd years before the Civil War happened
Well, here.
here.
In Britain,
Yeah.
I mean, it was 1837, but technically they did not free everyone, and they
Mm-hmm.
still had like these terrible indentured servitude systems. So it was like
Mm-hmm.
six of
Mm-hmm.
one, five and a half dozen of the other. I don't know,
Right.
but
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
but like I mean, it was different. Although I will say, I actually ended up writing an article after I had done the book, where I actually got to talk about the U.S. in all of this a little bit more because it just didn't really fit in that narrative.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I learned is that the like capital of illegal international slave trading in like the 1850s and 60s was New York City,
I can see that.
right?
I can see that. Yeah.
So it's
Mm-hmm.
like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
oops.
Yeah.
So, but it was never the same thing. Like Britain dominated the slave trading market. Their
Mm-hmm.
exit was huge. Our exit
Mm-hmm.
was not noticeable from
Yeah.
that.
And it's so funny with that too, because even as horrid as it was here in the States, our version of slavery here was mild compared to like Brazil and the Caribbean and all that, and
Yeah.
smaller as well. So for as horrible it was here, when you look at it in the complete context of it globally,
Mm.
it wasn't
Well,
as bad here, but it was still atrocious. So.
yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, like, and it's really just anywhere they grew sugar, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
we can just narrow it down, right?
Right,
Because you
right.
still have southern Louisiana, I think, in like parts of Florida, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
But like anywhere they were growing sugar,
It was
it
brutal.
was real bad,
Mm-hmm.
basically. And it's
Yeah.
just like a cavalcade of people getting like maimed and killed, and like the average life
Mm-hmm.
expectancy was 7 years. And then
Yeah.
and also that's why they couldn't self-replenish for folks who haven't got to that part yet,
Mm-hmm.
is because the majority of workers on a sugar plantation would be male, so the gender ratio would be completely skewed on the
Mm-hmm.
United States because they had come up with this new system of inheritable chattel slavery, which
Mm-hmm.
is a change from English law, actually,
Mm-hmm.
where slavery follows the mother, or it for here. So because of that, they had to import.
Mm-hmm.
Like they basically assumed that a large quantity of the folks on the plantation were going to die any given year
Mm-hmm.
because they would. And then
Mm-hmm.
so importation was like a necessary part of the business model as far as like Brazilian slave holders were concerned, as well
Mm-hmm.
as slave
Okay.
traders, because most of them were coming from or to Brazil
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
or Cuba.
Yeah. This woman is brilliant, y'all. You must pick up this book. It is her. This book is so detailed. It's just an inkling of how brilliant she is.
Well, I just like, I always want to ask more questions, right? Like, I get very annoyed when I'm reading a nonfiction book and then I have to look something up on the internet. I find
Mm-hmm. It's
like,
like
I'm like,
a rabbit hole. You just
right? And well, and it's just like, but why didn't you just tell me?
right.
Especially if it was something easy, right? If it's just me
Mm-hmm.
going off on a tangent, look, that's me. That's my personal problem. I get that. But if it was something just like real, like simple, like a little
Mm-hmm.
toss off, couldn't you
Right.
just tell me?
Right.
Like here,
Just
so I don't have to go.
parentheses, footnote, something.
Yeah, anything, anything. Oh, I wanted footnotes. I wasn't allowed to. I'm gonna keep campaigning, but they wouldn't let me. Yeah, so I couldn't even have numbered endnotes, which is why the endnotes are trailing endnotes because
Why?
the concern I think was that it would appear too academic, when it's not
Ah,
actually as dry as, like, I guess many end notes would make it appear. And I
okay.
have many. So I think that was also probably part of it. If I were a 1 to 2 per page person,
Mm-hmm.
I think that might be different, but I am not.
Not.
So,
You could
yeah.
spend a couple of days just reading through the sources and the
Oh, I have
citations
favorite
and the,
footnotes.
yeah.
I 100% have favorite footnotes. There's one where there's an actual song that the sailors wrote about one of their victories, and so I put the entire text of the song in there.
Mm-hmm.
There's one where we talk about the governorship of Sierra Leone.
Mm-hmm.
It's like 5 dudes in like, I don't know, like a year and a half. It's ridiculous is what it is. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so there's just like I get it, right? Like I am very tempted by scope creep. It's like, but that sounds interesting too, you know. And what I need to like, so I need to give myself an outlet for that. So usually what I'll do is I'll just make a little footnote for myself, right,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
in the text, and I'll deal with that later. But
Mm-hmm.
when it came to actually, I was like, you know what? Why don't I just? You guys want to know, right?
Right.
Right here. I
Right.
think this is super interesting. I'm gonna give it to you. You
Yes.
can do what you
Yes.
want with it.
Lots of
So
breadcrumbs to continue on your own research.
yeah,
Absolutely.
I
Yeah.
think it's the best when you can go read more stuff for yourself. Like,
Oh,
I'm not trying to
absolutely.
hide the ball.
Exactly. Exactly. So, talk about the impact of Britain's decision to outlaw the transatlantic slave trade.
Huge would be an understatement. At that point, Portugal was the has I believe is the all timer for the slave trade, but by that point, Britain had far and away surpassed them, taken over the market completely. I believe Britain's market share was in like the 40%. Right? It was
Mm-hmm.
a lot.
Right.
Especially given that, we weren't so much trading enslaved people to England, right? Like that's not where folks were going. But it was a lot of British ships with British captains and British sailors and British owners and, British buyers potentially because they owned a plantation in Jamaica or
Mm-hmm.
whatever, right? And they were definitely going to the colonies.
Right.
So, so their decision, the decision to withdraw was massive. I mean, like it was huge, and it was like deeply fought in Parliament, even when they did do it. Notably, I believe at the time he's the Duke of Clarence, but the future William IV, the Sailor King,
Mm-hmm.
totally was opposed to the idea of ending the slave trade, and then ends up in charge of what the policy is on the slave trade later. So, spoilers. But did he care? He did not. So, yeah. So they go through all this, and there had been massive campaigns up until this point. Sort of circling back. Excuse me. To your previous question,
Mm-hmm.
where you were asking about like comparing abolitionist movements, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That there had been massive campaigns to this point to end the slave trade. So like people are doing boycotts, which I learned from a podcast the other day that the term boycott originates in Ireland and it's somebody's last name.
What?
I know. Everybody,
Wow.
one of my friends is like, "You are always good for a Snapple fact," and I'm like,
I'm gonna start calling you Snapple. That's gonna be my
"I'm
name
okay
from
with
here.
that." Snapple cat fact, Jack. He's my new tagline, apparently. Someone pay me from Snapple. But
Sponsorships.
right, like I don't know. Do y'all do anything bad? Wait, hold on. Let's talk. Speaking of
Right.
rabbit holes. But like so they withdraw, right? And so this isn't, to some extent it is a measured withdrawal, right? Because like investors didn't all necessarily pull out it right away. Like people definitely, wanted to try it for the first few years there. But what they do under the sort of exigencies of war is they set some ships to patrol in Africa. or on the western coast of Africa. And that's actually where the squadron that the Black Joke belongs to really gets its start, is in that moment. So what happens afterwards is that they, after the war ends, is they have to renegotiate the ability to capture ships. Because during a war, if it's an enemy, take what you want, do what you
Right.
will. It's
Right.
war. But
Right.
when it's not, you have to actually, I don't know, obey laws or
Mhm.
something.
Mhm.
So then suddenly you have this really huge impact on like the geopolitical question as well. And
Mhm.
what? Because first of all, your courts of mixed commission, which is what ends up coming to be as a
Mhm.
result, some
Mhm.
scholars argue are like the progenitor of modern human rights courts today. Right,
Mhm.
the
Mhm.
notion of that being something that we can do something about basically starts here.
Mhm.
And then as well, you also have a lot of negotiations that happened in order to get other countries to go along with it, right?
Mhm.
Because Britain's not the boss of everybody,
Right.
as much as they felt like they were.
Right. Exactly.
So now we have to figure that out, right? And so obviously their negotiating tactics really varied by how much power you had and how much money you had and how white you were. And so,
Right.
right.
Right. Mhm.
So the when they're negotiating with a lot of like African powers, kings, chieftains, whatnot, queens. There's a little bit more of that sort of gunboat diplomacy, if you will,
Mhm.
where there's a lot more threatening and whatnot. When they're
Right.
negotiating with other powers that are like, say, European powers, for instance, they paid Spain off and they paid Portugal off huge sums of money
Mhm.
to get them to acquiesce to the right of the British to board their ships. They couldn't board France's ships because France was like double knucks to the end. No, 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 no. We
Mhm.
literally just fought a war with you. We've been fighting wars with you for ages. We say
Mhm.
no thank you, except en français.
Mhm.
And we're not doing that. And so that took another several years of negotiating and some regime changes in France. Like,
Mhm.
literal kings had to literally be overthrown
Mhm.
for that
Mhm.
to actually get negotiated.
Mhm.
And by the same token, you have Britain negotiating with Brazil, who's like, hi, we'd like to be independent. What you think?
Right.
And Britain is like, cool about that slave trade though,
Uh-huh.
and that's how they're like getting into, I'm like, obviously I am simplifying, but that's how they're getting
Right.
into these negotiations.
Right.
And so you have a choice made in 1807, well, fought for far before, but then made in 1807,
Mhm.
that ends up having repercussions not just on the slave trade itself, which is a huge economic question,
Mhm.
right? But it also has massive implications on literally like nation building and how we conceptualize human rights. Like
Mhm.
it is a very far reaching thing that we don't actually talk about, I think, in that way enough. Because like to me, the question that I always thought was super interesting about this book was, how did the slave trade end? And if you ask someone that,
Mhm.
yeah, and I'm not trying to put myself above it because I like to think I read a lot of stuff, and but
Mhm.
I would have
Right.
been like, because I don't really think anybody's ever asked me before,
Right.
and then I'm like, I don't know law, but
Right.
obviously, like even just thinking about that doesn't make sense that it was just laws. Like
Mhm.
something had to enforce that because people go make
Right.
money, CEG
Right.
drugs, right? Like
Right.
so.
Right. 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 Yeah.
Yeah, so I just it's everywhere. It's everywhere now. it
Oh
is
yeah.
it is just
Oh yeah.
all over the place.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So these next three questions that I have are things that you actually hit on that I'd like you to just expound upon a little bit. So
It's a pop
first,
quiz.
this is not a pop quiz. Shut the hell up. The courts of mixed commission. Tell our readers what that is.
Okay, so like I
Very
was just
interesting.
saying,
Hmm.
Britain had to independently negotiate, which with every party, right,
Hmm.
to get this deal done. So there end up being four courts of mixed commission. One barely anything ever happens at, so we don't really worry about them. Which was in Suriname. But then that was with the Dutch, I want to say, and then there is one in Havana. and there is one in Rio. God, and the last but not least, there is one in Freetown. And Freetown, in Sierra Leone, and Freetown had the highest conviction rate by far because it was mostly staffed with only British judges. That's amazing. How did that happen? And it happened because these other powers considered Freetown to be sort of a backwater. It had only been established as a colonial holding by Britain in the late 18th century. So anybody want to go there because they didn't want to catch, malaria or yellow fever or Sierra Leone fever is what they actually called it, I think, at the time, among other things. So it was hard to get it staffed, right? But eventually they did have a Brazilian judge there. So, so what would happen is you are awesome and you capture a slaver. Good for you. You can't just keep it and free everybody. Legally speaking, I mean, do you if you're time traveling? But legally speaking, you can't do that. So you have to take it somewhere to determine what to do about it. Well, how does that work? Whose law controls? That's weird. So you have to have an agreed upon body by treaty that exists to adjudicate these matters, ostensibly staffed by judges representing both or all countries involved, right? And so that's what a court of mixed commission did. So you would cruise into Freetown with your slave ship stinking nigh unto heaven, which is because that was one of the most fascinating facts I think I learned during all of this, is that you could smell them a mile away, which is
you could literally smell them before you could see them coming,
by a lot. And it's just like that really, like, it just speaks to the level of filth in a way that I don't think, like, when we say it's inhumane conditions, like, but what does that mean? Like, bodies have rotted in houses that people couldn't smell a mile away. Like, it really says something. So you bring your ship in, you go before the court of mixed commission. There's like some evidence presented, hopefully you captured it with enslaved people on board, because it's really the only way you're super going to get that conviction unless something else is going on. You shouldn't even bother to bring it in if you didn't capture it with enslaved people on board at this point, because there was something that needed to exist and it didn't exist yet, called the equipment clause. And the equipment clause is basically that you could then detain and adjudicate a slaving vessel based on the equipment on it, because you could tell when a vessel was a slaving vessel, it had particular tool requirements, and so if they had all the implementations for transporting slaves or enslaved people, then you could arrest them for it after the implementation of the equipment clause. But unfortunately, that doesn't exist for most of the Black Joke's history.
I thought that was so interesting that you could be sitting there and all of that equipment could be in plain sight, but you would basically be let go because there weren't any enslaved. How they would get the enslaved people off the ship, and then they would come inspect, and even though they see everything there, that is like, yes, this is a slaver ship.
Yeah, because if they weren't physically present, no. And part of that was the fact that it had to be negotiated in the first place, right? Like, Portugal and Spain weren't trying to lose money or have unhappy rich dudes. I don't know. But, like, or Brazil for that matter, So if you're dealing with all of that, like, you're not going to make it easy for the people who are coming to the negotiating table to be like, oh yeah, go ahead, end our slave trade now that you're out of it. Wait, what? Because I believe I heard the phrase market vacuum, not opportunity to do less, and that was more the vibe, And so so you're in a court of mixed commission, you present your evidence, it gets decided in your favor, let's say, right? If it doesn't get decided in your favor, you got to let everybody go.
Right.
On your way. But it gets decided in your favor, which means then you get to sort of dispense of everything that was on that ship, right? Any materials, any whatnots. Now, a lot of this is going to be recouped to the government of the British government and whatnot. Like, some of the money would be split. So you would get a certain amount of prize money if you were on a ship that captured another ship based on your rank. When the government would dispense that prize money is another question entirely, but you were owed that prize money based on your rank on the ship. And we're talking about like life-changing money for the time period, like multiple years salary money for just one ship potentially, if it were rich enough, right?
Right,
So you
right.
can sell everything on board, auction or sale or keep, whatever, right? You do what you got to do. Usually through the government because nobody else is bringing ships in. So we're talking about officers of the government. So I could say do whatever you want to do, but that is flip. It is not
Right.
true.
Mm-hmm.
And last but not least, or whenever, you would auction off the ship itself.
Mm-hmm.
You could buy it yourself, which was very, great used shipping at a low dollar amount. It's
Mm-hmm.
great,
Mm-hmm.
usually minimal refurbishment. You'd be fine. You already had it all kitted out. It was right
Mm-hmm.
there, scrub it
Mm-hmm.
down and let's go.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you could also auction it to someone else. That's where things got a little sticky because even though you weren't supposed to be auctioning to anyone who would dare engage in the slave trade again. Lots of them had who? British agents. Why? Because British people weren't supposed to be engaging in the slave trade. No way. So they're fine. They can purchase
Mm-hmm.
ships all they want to. And then those ships would change hands and end up right back in the slave trade more often than not. There are multiple ships in this who go through at least 3 name changes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Yep.
So,
Very interesting. So the Court
yeah.
of Mixed Commission is basically where you caught the slave ship, you go there, you hold
Hmm.
court,
Hmm.
and then if, they decide in your favor, the people are let off the ship.
Hmm.
And that brings me to Freetown, which I've heard of Freetown because I had 2 guests on my show last year that wrote a children's book.
Hmm.
And it's about tales, West African tales, and they're from Sierra Leone. And he was telling me about Freetown and how Freetown is this hodgepodge of people who were about to be enslaved and people who were enslaved here that from like North Carolina, South
Hmm.
Carolina that came there, and how you can see the Geechee culture and all of that there in Freetown. But
Hmm.
tell us what Freetown in Sierra Leone is.
It's the British capital of their colony, which
Mm-hmm.
they decided one day had to be established a couple of times. There's some, it would be wacky hijinks if it weren't colonization, right?
Right,
But
right.
some things went down, and so they had to go through it a few times. But they finally get it established by the
Mm-hmm.
time of the Black Joke, which is about 1827.
Mm-hmm.
1828. There's about 15,000 residents ish in
Mm-hmm.
Freetown. So actually sizable, right?
Mm-hmm.
Bigger than I think folks might realize.
Mm-hmm.
A large quantity of them were, let's say, repatriated.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Enslaved African, not even
Mm-hmm.
repatriated. That's a lie. No, it's black folks. The British were like, you should stay here,
Right.
but you're free.
Mm-hmm.
We swear.
Right.
Um,
Right.
so they referred to them as liberated Africans.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the books referred to them as recaptives. That seems right. But
Mm-hmm.
once we're talking about in Freetown itself, technically, recaptive Africans would be given a choice, a bit of a Hobson's choice, but a choice
Mm-hmm.
where you could chill in Freetown, get there, you get a parcel of land, they give you like some fabric because God knows don't be naked. This is Britain.
Stop it.
My eyes are up here. Um, so can't have that. So, like some really basic like tool stuff, and the idea is that you're going to work the land, and eventually this colony is going to become profitable, right?
Mm-hmm.
As
Mm-hmm.
land growing and whatnot, or food growing and all that jazz,
Mm-hmm.
and at least self-sustaining. Then you could join a segregated unit in Africa, fighting other Africans for the British.
Mm-hmm.
Or you could go to Jamaica or other places as an indentured servant ish, where you were going to be, oh, wait, doing the exact same thing you would have been
Yeah.
doing if they had just let your ass
Let the
go
ship go. Yeah.
in the first place.
Exactly.
Um, enjoy. And those were the main options. There are other two, like obviously unnamed options. One is die. Lots of people
Right.
did that one because a lot of those illnesses like kept up. Like we said, the ships were filthy, filthy, and there are like a million and one diseases basically that you could catch, like with horrific stories accompanying all of them. Um, but the other option was sort of either we'll call it runaway slash escape slash mutiny, wherein if you caused enough trouble or just decided, F y'all, I'm out. Right.
Right.
And you went up to what they called the hinterlands, up towards the mountains in Sierra Leone, which is behind Freetown, from my understanding of it. Um, then they were like, well, they gone. Forget it. I don't care.
Really
It was
good.
work. I don't like it.
Right.
Yeah, so that was a less traveled path, but people did travel it, and it's like we want to leave room for that because people were not content to just be like, oh, cool, where I just live in, where is this called now? You know,
Right.
like that's not a thing. So
Right.
people
Right.
did try to like go places, but also people acclimated, right? You know, communities formed. They had all sorts of like parties and festivals and all kinds of, you know, they tried to make it very much a sort of standard city environment life, even though it was sort of small and obviously not as built up, with an extraordinarily minority white population. I think at one point it's like 300, 400 white people are there for like 15,000 people, something like that. It's, but you know, they're in charge
Right. Yeah.
because of course. Although like there had been governors of Sierra Leone who had been more about that life of like, well, what if we let black people into the actual positions where they decide things for themselves? And then subsequent
Right.
governors like, what if we didn't? Savages,
Right. Damn
you
it.
know, they can't govern themselves. You know, whatever.
I do not understand that paternalistic thing that we just cannot take care of ourselves. I just,
It is wild.
it's
It is
just
truly deeply wild.
all through slavery, and just even now you
Yeah.
see it with white people and the
Yeah.
way that they treat black people, and it's just like, you know, we are functioning, wildly intelligent adults, most of us. We can govern
Well,
ourselves.
like every population has their folks, right?
Right, right. But we, for the most part, we can go. I mean, shit, we survived 250 years of slavery. I think
That
we're
part.
good. We
Right.
can handle it. Just leave
We've
us
been dealing with
alone.
y'all this long. We're still here.
Right. We're good. We can handle this. We got it. We got it. You know?
No, I just don't think so. Honey, you need us.
Just to make my neck itch.
My soul is irked now. Thank you.
Yes. Completely irked. Ah! And so I probably should have said this one first, but tell us what the West African squadron is.
Oh, well, so I started going there and then I didn't finish going there, so this all works out for both of us. Redux. But so the squadron forms, like I said, it officially forms after peace has been declared in the Napoleonic Wars in 1815. I say officially because it obviously existed before that, just in the context of a wartime footing, right? So then it's reestablished on a peacetime footing, shall we say. But so it existed for a while at that point. There were usually anywhere from, during this period and before, once they sort of built it up, there are anywhere between 5 and 7 official British ships usually on the coast at any given time. The Black Joke ushered in an era of tenders, which is what it was, which is to say that it was assigned essentially to the Sybil, its parent ship, if you will. And this is because the Black Joke was owned not by the Navy, but by the captain of the Sybil, who was also the commander of the fleet.
Right.
And so at that point, So you have all these ships, and if you had the money or the wherewithal or whatnot to purchase tenders, many of these captains did, because especially in this new incarnation, which had to be established as legal. It was a thing, where they're like, "Can we do this?" And they're like, "Yes," because we're not going to do anything to ourselves that makes it harder. That's
Right.
the other negotiating party's job. So yeah, the law totally works that way. Because the idea is that a tender is legally indistinguishable from its parent ship, if you will. So if the Black Joke made a capture, the Sybil made a capture. And so that's who, and the money we get, and the Black Joke was staffed by sailors from the Sybil. Right, so didn't even have its own crew. Its crew came from another ship, even, and so it ushered in an era of more of these because they were effective. But then it was a short-lived trend for reasons, and so we end up with that sort of going away. But the squadron also gets bigger. But yeah, that's like the 18th butt in that sentence. Whatever, folks will live. But the squadron gets bigger in part because towards the end of the Black Joke's tenure, there's a merging of two separate squadrons. One that's down by like the Cape in the southern area of Africa, and the other that's sort of above Nigeria through, that whole curve right there on the western coast of Africa. And they decided to merge these into one squadron, which seems nonsensical given how far apart that was, but good job. Because that curved all the way, like they were going all the way up around, like to up by Cape Verde is actually the upper limits of their patrolling area for this squadron. So we're still talking like 3,000 miles of coastline easily. And that's before they merged the two squadrons. But, so you had ships in the squadron that were notoriously slow. Poor little Plumper. It's a real ship's name, y'all. But bless it, just chugging along, doing its very best, and there were other ships that were somewhat effective, and there were also a lot of potential, folks saw each other, there were transfers, there were rivalries, the whole system of British promotion is wild in this era when it comes to like patronage and sort of very much who you know and how they know you and whether or not they can scratch your back to get somebody else to scratch somebody else's back in like a giant back scratching circle that gets somebody promoted, like, or get somebody a cushy or a plum, rather not even cushy, a plum appointment, because it was very difficult to get promoted in a peacetime setting. And one of the only places that was regularly seeing action at this juncture was Western Africa, because they were actually doing stuff. So you could actually still catch prize ships with all the life-changing money, potentially, on the western coast of Africa in a way that you could not in most other stationings in the Navy. Now, your risk of dying went up exponentially because of the disease. Like, there's opens with a quote like, beware, beware the vitamin E. And there's one comes out where 30 went in. And it's like, that's an exaggeration. But they died a lot of just like disease, any sort of, just tropical maladies that they weren't accustomed to. And just things that could happen on ships, although British ships were notoriously clean, comparatively, not just compared, just notoriously clean. They're pretty anal retentive about that. Are we allowed to say that anymore? Anal retentive?
I still do.
Great. Okay.
I have my own laws. I don't follow anybody else's rules.
Okay. Hey, I never know. I'm just like, did we discover something? Does this not actually mean what we think it means? It's actually named after some terrible mad scientist named Anal who like, I don't know, did something terrible. I don't know, so I just like to check in. Sometimes you don't know where the slang comes from.
Listen, I've been using that I don't know how long.
I think we know where this one comes from.
All right.
That was just a hypothetical. It's a very silly one.
Right. But yeah, so the West African squadron, you have this small amount of ships like patrolling this whole coastline for slave ships. And it's just like, really?
It's like hunting for needles in an ocean. Oh wait, yeah, because it's so much. It's so much space. They're freakishly understaffed. And then they find a way to fix that, sort of.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, how about y'all just actually, this system, it works so well. The ships don't go back into circulation. They just come to us. And then they're way cheaper than building our own. This
Right.
system works. And the Admiralty was like, fuck off. We don't care.
Right. Yeah. Crazy. Crazy.
And that's how that went. But yeah, the squadron is so interesting. I think, like, just it's in the grand scale of things I've never heard of, right? Like this book was also filled with things I'd never heard of. To be clear, like I'm not ever trying to come at folks being like I know everything. I do not. And I because in W.E.B. Du Bois's The Suppression of the Atlantic Slave Trade, which you're like there was a what? There was a squadron of who? What?
Right.
Wait, what? And it gets like very quickly, you get very interested in what the heck they were doing. And I mean, they would continue to exist in some form for another couple of decades until you get the more thorough, I guess, crackdown on the international slave trade from Britain.
Yeah. Crazy. So much. You learn, you think you're learning something, and then you learn about something else from that, and it's just like it just keeps expanding and expanding and expanding. It's just anybody who says they know
Yeah.
everything there is to know about history, I'm just like, yeah, okay, you're somebody I need to stay away from because there's no
Facts.
way. Yeah, there's no way.
Yeah.
So
No, that's real
at
talk.
the end of each chapter, well, at the beginning of the chapter, you give the name of the ship and then how many people were enslaved on that ship. But then at the end of each chapter, you showed the slave ship's register. Why did you feel that was important to include that?
Sort of see
Yeah.
what's up.
There you go. Yep.
Well, so you can only you can only do so much, especially like when your research options are a little bit restricted by COVID. And so any story like this runs the risk of being a story, yet one more story about white guys saving people from other white guys, I guess. And that's not great, because that's not really what's happening here. And there's not a super accessible way to get at these people's stories. Now, there may be, right? In the sense that, like, the British did love to keep a record, right? And it was a British colony. So there might be things that are records of people whose names are, like, in those registers where you could, like, trace their lives in Sierra Leone, right? Or their disposition somewhere, but without being able to go, that wasn't really going to happen. And I just wanted to put names to it, because it's one thing to say that like 300 people or 600 people or many thousands gone or many millions gone, right? But it's like, because those numbers are big, I think abstraction allows a bit of distance from what's really happening here, and looking at a list of names and heights and like identified gender and like if they have any tribal or scarification markings, like, is it anywhere near that person's story? No, but it is an acknowledgement that that person's story does exist and that that person's story matters. And just because they weren't, I don't know, knighted in the Royal Navy doesn't mean that, it does mean that I don't have sources, but it doesn't mean that they should just continue to be unacknowledged as a figure, or one of a figure on a page. And I only did the first page of each ship's register, right? Because there was not room for the extra,
Yeah.
a lot of pages that would have been. But it was something to sort of give people that glimpse of that reality, I think, and also put something. There's a magic to being in an archive, and like, so when you actually are touching an old record or handling, not really handling, but handling someone's
Right.
letters, or something. There's like, I saw letters from Collier's mother written to Admiral Nelson asking how her like it were, and he no vice versa, him writing to her like reassuring her that like young Frank Collier is
It's
fine,
okay. Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and there's something really like fascinating, and it's like even if you're like what, and it's like do I care about Nelson? I mean, he was a scandal. So if you
Mm-hmm.
if you like your British war heroes, just Tom Catton, like their lives depended on it,
Mm-hmm.
go read about Nelson.
Right.
Um, but like that's something that existed like 250 years ago, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
somebody wrote this in pencil on a ship that like was in a major whatever, like 250 years ago. And there's
Mm-hmm.
just something about that, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not obviously the same thing, but I also like the idea of not just reproducing it, right? Because you could have just, put the names in a chart, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But the idea of literally reproducing the page. So it's like if
Right.
you had that ledger open, it would look a
Mm-hmm.
little bit like this,
Right. Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. Amazing. And it's kind of like say their names, you know.
Yeah, exactly. It's exactly
Mm-hmm.
like that. Yeah, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. So, what is one thing that you hope readers who read The Black Joke will take away from your book?
How the slave trade ended. There's an answer to that question, it turns out. Oh, she's complicated.
Wow, y'all.
But really, no, seriously, because it was a question I had never asked,
Mm-hmm.
and had never been asked of me. And
Mm-hmm.
the answer was incredibly revealing, it turned out.
Mm-hmm.
It
Mm-hmm.
explained a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And it
Mm-hmm.
said a lot. And so I think actually thinking about the slave trade as something that had to be affirmatively ended. It did not just into the wind or whatever. It actually had to be like prohibitions against it had to be enforced. People did not want to go along with it. There were people to whom a humanitarian argument was made whenever people are like, but they were of their time. And I'm like, so were the other people who were
Mm-hmm.
saying that they were morally terrible and going to
Mm-hmm.
hell.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I
Exactly.
mean, we're all of our times, but if somebody's standing out there telling you some stuff and you don't want to listen, how much of a pass do I have to give you, right?
Right.
Um, and so I think that thinking about the slave trade in the sense of this is a thing that had to be stopped, it
Mm-hmm.
took decades. It did not
Mm-hmm.
take the work of it took decades. If you talk about even the battle to just get to abolition, we're
Mm-hmm.
talking from basically the big middle end of the 17th century in Britain, or 17th, sorry, 18th century in Britain, all the way through about you could say the 1850s, you could say the 1890s when they actually did that accord with all the other European powers and jumped
Mm-hmm.
off the scramble slash partition of Africa. But we're talking like a century,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
essentially, to end the slave trade, which of course has not ended, right?
Mm-hmm.
The international trade in chattel slavery, as we know it, the transatlantic slave trade has ended,
Right.
right? But slavery exists and
Mm-hmm.
people are still slave traded, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
so ended is also relative. So, how did the slave trade end? The other answer is it didn't. It just
Mm-hmm.
changed, you
Right.
know? And so I think that having a way to access or explore or begin to think about that question, you
Mm-hmm.
know, what happened
Mm-hmm.
here?
Right.
That's to me, that's the biggest takeaway. I really think that because
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of like interesting granular stuff. I try to keep it so it's not just all a complete slog. Like I have friends who have apologized to me for not reading my book yet, and I'm like, it is depressing out. It's okay, like it's
Yeah. I
fine.
mean.
I get it. It's a heavy subject,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
but
Mm-hmm.
like there are like some moments of just like just fun anecdote or
Mm-hmm.
whatever. And there's a lot to learn about how life and law and like a lot of other geopolitical things happened. But when it really 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 comes down to it, if I had to just name one thing, even
Mm-hmm.
though technically that means I'm naming everything,
Mm-hmm.
the answer is how did the slave trade end?
Mm-hmm. Okay. So y'all heard it. You got to get the book. And I need a physical copy because I have it on my Kindle, and I need a physical copy because I need to go back and read it again.
Okay.
And I need
We
it
can work on
signed.
that.
So,
Oh, okay.
so
Is it
where
okay if it's a British copy?
I don't care as long as I
Well,
can
it's
read
gonna
it.
spell all the words with like the OUR and stuff.
Mm.
Yo, people be having feelings. You know it's true.
If it's signed by you,
It's true.
just tell me where to. Don't start the songs again because I will sing that one too.
Don't challenge me to a good time. I'm here for it. Let's go.
Well, we have come to the
Let's do
end
the
of
copyright.
our very first episode of season 4, AE Rooks, and we all call you Rooks. Thank you so much for being here, sharing your time and your talents and your immense intelligence with us today.
Thank you for having me. It's like, it's no fun to share my times, talents, and apparently immense intelligence. I hide it in the hair. It's fine. With somebody who can't bounce it all back, right? Like you need the give and take. You need all that goodness. So thank you so much. It's been like a great convo. I had a ton of fun, clearly.
Oh, yay. I'm so glad you did. And Booze and Bros, you know how I do. At the end of every episode, I leave you with a quote. And today it comes from Frederick Douglass. And it's a little long, but here we go. I am filled with unutterable loathing when I contemplate the religious pomp and show, together with the horrible inconsistencies which everywhere surround me. We have men stealers for ministers, women whippers for missionaries, and cradle plunderers for church members. The man who wields the blood-clotted cowskin during the week fills the pulpit on Sunday and claims to be a minister of the meek and lowly Jesus. The slave auctioneer's bell and the church-going bell chime in with each other, and the bitter cries of the heartbroken slave are drowned in the religious shouts of his pious master.
Woo! Tell him.
Until next time, y'all, you know what to do. Grab a book and read, and I'm out. Thank you for lending me your ear today. If you've enjoyed this independent podcast, you can help me continue to shine the light on Black authors and their stories by becoming a patron at patreon.com/betweenthereads, or by giving a one-time gift at www.ko-fi.com/betweenthereadspodcast. That's ko-fi.com/betweenthereadspodcast. Tune in next time for another great episode.